Posted by you/Vakadant. Medical workers of Reddit, what were the most haunting last words you've heard from a patient? I'm an emergency nurse, and there's one thing that always gets me when patients die. Not what they say, but what their husband/wife/parents say when they've gone. I've had it a few times, but the most memorable was a man in his 70s whose wife had just passed away. He was holding her hand and crying, and he just looked up at me and said, "I've loved her for 55 years, she's my whole life. What do I do without her?" It breaks me every time. Nurse, in hospital caring for 40-ish man with a brain tumor, coming in and out of consciousness. Not to be resuscitated. His 16-year-old daughter was crying nonstop for 12 hours. His wife, who had been given a few months to prepare herself, was calm and focused on her husband. I had to routinely check his level of consciousness, which involved talking to him in a loud voice, response to auditory stimulation, which I did not like to do. So I asked his wife to do the loud voice part, so the voice he would hear would be hers, not mine, and she did so without hesitation. The only response we observed with her vocalization was that this by now profoundly unconscious patient took her hand to his lips and kissed it. He stopped breathing very soon after that. I am haunted, but not in a bad way. My husband is a PICU nurse, and one morning he came home in a bit of a daze. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me about a little boy who had been in PICU for a few days already and wasn't getting better. Most nights, the little boy would wake up, so one of the nurses would keep him company while he fell asleep again. My husband was doing just that. He read him a book and then just sat there with the boy listening to music so he would go back to sleep. Before falling asleep, the little boy said, "You were my favorite." The boy passed away in the morning. His little heart gave out and refused to restart. Although all patients are important, some leave more of an impression than others. Until that point, that little boy hadn't stood out to my husband, and he felt terrible about it because he had made a big impression on that little boy. That was the only patient's funeral he has ever attended. The sweet guy in his 20s with endocarditis, heart valve infection, caused by 4 drug abuse. I was prepping him for his 3rd open heart surgery when he sat up, looked me in the eye, and said, "I'm going to die, aren't I?" He did not survive the surgery. It wasn't words, but the most haunting death was a patient who was DNR, through her and her family's wishes. She was losing her battle, and her family wasn't there. She was getting frantic and looking around and half sitting up in bed, and a nurse with more experience than me took her hand and calmly said, "It's okay. You're not alone. We're right here with you, it's okay to leave." The patient immediately calmed, put her head back on the pillow, and died. I knew I wanted to be that nurse when I grew up. How the hell did she know just what to do and say? I've never forgotten it. When I was a senior resident, a young man, late 20s, was admitted for pneumonia. He got worse quickly, and I was called to his room to help while on call that night. He was having trouble breathing and needed to be intubated. I explained all this to him and that I would sedate him and then get him intubated so we could help him breathe. He agreed and we got everything ready. The last thing he said to me was, "Doc, please don't let me die." I told him I would do my very best. I got him intubated and transferred to the ICU. A few weeks later, I was on call covering the ICU and he was barely hanging on. I knew he would not make it through the night. He went into VFib several times and I was able to bring him back, but only briefly. He was just too sick and he died shortly after that. It was horrible talking to his mother and girlfriend and comforting them, knowing the last words he ever spoke were to me saying, "Please don't let me die." Not the very last words, but I had a patient in her early 20s who was severely thrombocytopenic and bleeding profusely for days ask me if she was going to make it. I had to look her in the eyes and tell her there is a good chance she wouldn't. I thought she would burst into tears, but no, she just kind of sat back and accepted it. I think she already knew. She died shortly after I got off shift. RN here. I don't remember this guy's admitting diagnosis. He wasn't assigned to me, but my coworker asked me to help start N4 on him. He needed a unit of blood and his peripheral access had gone bad. I placed a tourniquet and was ready to stick, then he looked at me and said, "I'm dying." Immediately went unresponsive. I checked his pupils, I watched one dilate and the other constrict. We coded him, never got him back. Not a medical worker, but when I was 14 my friends and I were joking around before our 7th period theater class. My one friend, who was always a big goof, was playing along with a joke that he and another classmate were breaking up and said, "This relationship is over." Then spun around and fell to the floor for dramatic effect. Except it wasn't for dramatic effect, because he actually suffered heart failure and died instantly from an unknown condition, acute myocarditis. None of us realized it and laughed along. I even picked up his glasses from the floor and put them on to tease him about how blind he was. When I tried to give him his glasses back, I was struck by how discolored his face was, and then blood began to pour from his mouth. That's when the screaming started. Absolutely fucked me as a 14-year-old to realize we could all just drop dead at any moment. My pop died of lung cancer. The last lucid thing he did was wake up just long enough to sing "Show Me the Way to Go Home." I'm tired and I want to go to bed. I had a little drink about an hour ago and it went right to my head. It was pretty amazing and freaky at the same time. Fuck cancer. Had a patient in the cardiac ICU during my second month of the internship year who had newly diagnosed heart failure that we couldn't figure out what caused it. He was a healthy guy. In his 60s. Did yoga every day, and walked a few miles 5 days a week. The genuinely nice guy is always a bad prognostic sign. With his heart failure, his heart was so stretched out and not squeezing adequately to provide the blood and subsequent oxygen he needs to the rest of his body. A few nights into his hospital stay, I come in the next morning and discovered that the senior resident had to code him for sustained unstable heart arrhythmia, unstable VTOC. I went and talked with him about it the next morning and he told me that he was in and out of consciousness during it all, from the low blood pressure, but he compared it to the feeling of jumping out of the plane and skydiving. Later that morning I was checking on him again and he didn't look so good. He goes into arrhythmia again, drops his blood pressure, and is in and out of consciousness. As I'm charging the defibrillator to shock him again, he comes back around and briefly asks me if I'm taking him skydiving again and lets out a nervous laugh before losing consciousness. Not a medical worker, but my friend's husband was dying from cancer. He'd done lots of chemos and one surgery and overall his prognoses looked good. He'd gone through another surgery, and he was due to be released from the hospital a couple of days after this story takes place. My friend had been with him and was going back home to sleep for the night. Just before she left his room, he said, "I'm going to miss you, my love," and she thinks nothing of it, saying, "I'll miss you too. I'll be back in the morning." Couple of hours later he was gone. My buddy who went on to be a doctor had an elderly female patient. Probably 90 to 100 years old. Her daughter left the room to get coffee and my buddy had to check on her vitals. They were normal. Then she woke up, smiled, and got teary-eyed. She said, "I knew you'd come back for me. I'm sorry I didn't marry you. My family wouldn't let me. But I will now, I promise." My buddy just held her hand and smiled. She laid back and closed her eyes and her heart stopped. She had a DNR and was gone just like that. Her daughter had no clue what she meant. Her husband had been dead for 10 years and they were married since they were 20. My buddy doesn't know if it's relevant, but we are black and maybe she was in love with a black guy a long time ago. Because she was looking right at him when she spoke. Shit weird. I was with my father as he lay dying in the hospital. It was a long and emotionally exhausting process, so we kids took turns sitting with him and holding his hand for when he would wake up. He was in and out of lucidity, but just before he went he opened his eyes, gripped my hand hard, looked me in the eye, and said, "I don't like that guy in the black suit sitting over in the corner." My blood ran cold and I quickly looked over my shoot and there was an empty chair there. I don't know if he was remembering some incident from his past, hallucinating, or if he saw someone more sinister. I didn't mention it to my siblings for years and ever since then, they don't like to talk about it. I was about 5 or 6 when my grandfather was on his deathbed. The last thing he did was put his hand on my shoulder and said, "No wonder you never liked my spicy food." And then he passed about 10 seconds later. We were all super confused. About 3 months later I almost died from suffocation after eating some salsa. At the hospital, I was diagnosed with a capsaicin allergy, spicy food. To this day it still creeps me out. No one knew I was allergic before then, and I didn't show any signs either. Not my patient but a friend of mine. He had a patient with a AAA, abdominal aortic aneurysm. Your aorta is bulging and throbbing about ready to pop. The pain is very severe and agonizing, and if it does rupture the pain immediately goes away and feels so good, but your chances of survival are pretty much non-existent even if you are prepped on the operating table when it ruptures. Anyways, he had a 15-year-old with one and on the way to the hospital. She looked at him and just said, "Oh, that feels so much better," and died about 10 seconds later. Not a medical worker, but I knew a guy from middle school who had a degenerative disease and he knew he'd die young. It was New Year's Eve and he'd just gotten out of the hospital for the 3rd time in a few months, so we were partying at his apartment. Somehow I ended up being the last person there with him and his girlfriend, and we were pretty drunk and got to talking for a while about how great the party was, how nice it was to have friends like ours, and plans for the future. All of a sudden he said, "God, I wish I had more time. I always thought I'd have more time." Not his last words, but they're the ones that stuck with me. We weren't close by any stretch, but I always wished he had more time too. He was so friendly and kind, the type of person who made you feel like their closest friend even if you were a total stranger. He was a good man and he deserved a longer life. During my residency, I was on call and running the hospital, as senior residents tend to do. One of my responsibilities was being in charge of the entire ICU, which had about 16 to 20 bed capacity. I was taking care of a man who had bowel perforation, a hole in his intestines. He had an NG, nasogastric, tube up his nose into his stomach so that he wouldn't drown in his feces. His brother and sister-in-law came to visit him and they had a nice conversation. I walked in as they were leaving and they said to him make sure to listen to the doctor as they left. The patient and I talked a bit and he wasn't looking so good. I kept hearing a gurgling sound as he was speaking to me. The kind of sound you make when you rinse out your mouth with mouthwash and spit it out. I immediately checked his NG tube and it came right out. He looked at me and said I shouldn't have played with the tube. Before going pale and losing a pulse. I did everything in my power to save him that day, but his lungs were full of stool and he died 20 minutes later. The rest of the day I felt utterly numb and it still sits with me to this day. To have a patient smiling and laughing with you one moment, then being deceased 20 minutes later is one hell of a roller coaster ride. Not a healthcare worker, but my grandfather passed this week at 89 years old. He was a very sharp, sane man, not senile or with any dementia. In the 2 days leading to his passing, he began to see things. He told me, "Do you see Michelangelo's painting?" I said no. He said he's painting invisible dust. Everything he paints disappears. I hope the bathroom is still there. He also told us he could see little men jumping from the fan blades. It was really strange. It sounded like he was tripping acid, but he wasn't. He prayed over and over the night before he passed. We found him deceased in the morning. Frown. Paramedic here. I was transporting a cardiac patient and while we were both watching my EKG monitor, he went into fib, a lethal heart rhythm. His heart stopped pumping blood effectively at that point, but there was enough blood pressure for a few seconds of consciousness. He looked at me and said, "But I don't see the light." And went unconscious. Coded him, shocked him a few times, meds by the handful, but he died. Work in EMS. This doesn't happen very often. However, I do distinctly recall an elderly gentleman who was determined to die in his home. Kept saying, "I'm not going back to the hospital, I'm going to die here." The guy was having a pretty massive knee and was going to be dead in less than 12 hours. His wife and son pleaded for him to go to the hospital with us. Told him to think about his grandbabies. Told him point blank he was going to die if he stayed. Reminded him about how alone and scared his wife would be. Tried so damned hard to figure out why he was afraid to go back. My unit and fire stayed on the scene for over an hour trying to convince him to go. Even called a doctor to chat with him. He was old, but not old enough to go out just yet. Still mobile, fully present mentally. Sadly, we can't take people against their will, it's legally considered kidnapping. Eventually, we had to leave this man. He was dead the next morning. The funny thing is, I respect the hell out of him. I think he knew something we couldn't accept, that he would pass even with intervention. I wouldn't want my body worked if I knew I was going to die anyway. Resuscitation is a violent, often fruitless endeavor. The most haunting thing for me isn't the death or gore itself though. It's hearing the family screaming when death is announced. Hearing people, especially children, scream for their mothers is the most painful for me. My great-aunt was dying from breast cancer and all of our family went to see her in the hospital one more time. When we arrived she was already in and out of consciousness. When I held her hand she knew it was me and woke up and was able to whisper the last thing she ever said. It was difficult for her but she was able to softly whisper, "Tell everyone how much I will always love them and I'll never forget that special moment for the rest of my life. Love you, great auntie. Miss you tons XO." I'm a nurse. I started off working in the pediatrics ER. Toward the end of my first year, this woman came in with her 8-year-old daughter who was feeling dizzy and had a poor appetite. She hadn't had her flu shot and it was flu season, so she took her in because her symptoms were bad enough that she was worried that she may need medical intervention. So we asked her a few questions, then I noticed this huge red bruise on her side that covered half of her side. I noticed another one on her back when we went to check her heartbeat. Then she fainted. We were able to get her stable, and when she woke up she said she was just feeling weak. Because we were thinking flu, we got her hooked up to N4. I mentioned the bruises to the doctor and he asked the mother to leave so we could talk to the little girl in private. "Is there anything you want to tell us now that your mother's not here?" She nodded and looked down shamefully. We asked her what, and that's when she told us that she was bleeding. She admitted that for a month she had lots of nosebleeds at school, at least a few times a week, and then she showed us something that terrified us. She showed us an ulcer she had inside of her lip. We went from thinking flu to abuse to cancer fast. We sent her to get some tests done ASAP, and never heard her back. A few weeks later I transferred to St. Jude's. Turns out she was getting treated there, and her tests came back positive for leukemia. She was not doing well. I was working as a chemotherapy nurse right away and would work with her a lot along with a few other patients. She just got worse. Before one session she looked at me with the saddest eyes and said, "I don't think I'm going to live for much longer. Tell my mom that I love her more than anything and anyone else." It was so heartbreaking to hear, but nurses have to be stoic and I had to suck it up. After that session, another nurse took over and I ran outside and broke down crying. She died that night in her sleep. My uncle was born with Down syndrome. He was 42 when he died but had the mind of a 3-ish-year-old. He could do things like brush his teeth, dress, etc. but needed prompting and supervision. My GMA, his mother, died in 1974. My uncle died in 1984. The night before he died he told all of us that Mama came to see me last night. My dad asked him if he had a dream about Mama. He said no. She sat on my bed with me and told me she was coming to get me soon and take me home with her and not to be scared because it was all okay. We dismissed it. 24 hours later he was dead. He died peacefully in his sleep. I had a guy who had a cardiac arrest in a swimming pool. He came to my ICU. The lifeguards have managed to get him back at the poolside, so a short downtime usually means a good thing. Turned out he had dysthymia, funny heartbeat, which had resolved. So, we woke him up from his medically induced coma, and he was great. Smiling, waving, talking. He remembered feeling unwell in the swimming pool, etc. Fast forward 2 hours, and his nurse starts shouting for help. The guy is screaming and agitated. He grabs me and looks me square in the eyes and shouts, "Something bad is about to happen." I have never seen fear or panic like it. He pulls out all his lines, he bites through his arterial line so he's losing blood everywhere and he's standing on the bed screaming. We cannot calm him down or reassure him he is safe. He just screams and shouts and panics. And then he stops, collapses and goes into cardiac arrest, and dies. In the medical profession, we talk about a sense of impending doom. I now work in palliative care so see lots of people who die, but this was so visceral, he was so scared, it was harrowing. I will never forget the look in his eyes. I'm not a medical worker, but on February 28th of this year, we had a bad ice storm in Oklahoma. I had no choice but to go to work and I worked 45 miles from home. The roads were awful and a solid sheet of ice. I witnessed a car accident. A double tractor trailer semi versus a Ford Focus. I had to stop because of it and I ran/slid to her immediately. My dad is a retired firefighter/EMT and my mom is a nurse, so I wanted to try to help if I could. When I got to her she was hanging out of the driver's side window and the back of her head on one side was missing. When I went to feel for a pulse on her wrist, she grabbed me, even though she was unconscious. She was gurgling and wheezing. I stayed and held her as she died. I listened to the gurgling and begged her to open her eyes and she wasn't alone. That was the worst thing I heard. Her gurgling and death rattling. Obligatory, not a medical worker, but I think my grandpas qualify for both the most haunting while at the same time hilarious. He was diagnosed with stomach cancer when I was 16. However, due to the type of cancer it was and how it had metastasized, treatment wouldn't be effective. The silver lining was that it was otherwise a very slow-moving cancer. We knew he would die from it, but he still had years left. My grandpa was also the cheeriest, most fun-loving, and the jokey guy in the room, and even with the diagnosis was still in high spirits throughout the rest of his life. I think the fact that we all still had time left with him after the diagnosis helped with that. Cut to the Christmas after I turned 22. My grandpa's been in hospice care for the past 8 months. He's gotten to the point where he may pass any day now, so we're all visiting him regularly, so there are always a few family members with him, but since it's Christmas we're all there. 15 people crammed into what is effectively a small dorm room. Because it's been years now, all the tears have been cried. Everyone has more or less come to accept what is coming and we're all just chatting with him and spending time with each other. It honestly has the feel of after-dinner family time. Now a side effect of cancer at this point is that he's burping up this nasty stuff every so often, so he doesn't talk as much at this point. Not because he can't, but because it's painful because he has such a sore throat from the sick. Now the whole family is chatting and my grandma is sitting on my grandpa's bed holding his hand. It's warm and cozy and eventually, this soft lull falls over the room. That's when my grandpa pipes up in a voice that is much tougher and gravelly than usual. "Is it dead in here or is it just me?" And with that, he patted my grandma's hand, laid his head back on the pillow, closed his eyes, and went limp. It was astounding. And just a few seconds after the initial shock sunk, everyone in the room immediately got giggles. My grandpa was so loving and such a cut-up, it seemed only fitting that he left us with one last gag. R.I.P. Go-Go. I'm not a medical worker, but my mom told me about the situation she had when my grandma was passing away in hospital. Mom and aunt were with her every day until she felt just very weak and they called a doctor and staff. They told them to leave the room. After 10 minutes of just sitting in the hallway, Mom and aunt could hear a weird little sigh or moan, like the I feel good type of moan, which sounded like grandma. They both looked at each other at this time and felt like it was next to other. They got chills and goosebumps. They couldn't hear anything from the room because they were too far away from it. Then the doctor came to tell them that she passed. They still don't know what was that, but they like to think it was grandma's sighs, which meant that she finally felt good and found peace after struggling so much with her illness.